So welcome to our second session of Journalism Under Siege, Truth and Trust in a Time of Turmoil. It's great to see all of you here tonight. I'm Dawn Garcia. I'm the co-host of this course and the director of the John S. Knight Journalism Fellowships. This series is a collaboration with the Stanford Continuing Studies Program and the John S. Knight Journalism Fellowships here at Stanford. Each of our 5 nights is devoted to an important issue in journalism, an important issue that we focus on at the John S. Knight Fellowships at Stanford. Tonight's class is titled Power to the People, Holding the Powerful Accountable. One of the most important functions of a free press is to help hold people accountable, the powerful accountable to the people, whether that be companies, corporations, governments, platforms, or large institutions. Tonight we have top-notch journalists who are going to talk to you and have a conversation about globally and in our nation's capital how holding the powerful accountable happens in a real way. In the first hour, I'm going to be moderating a conversation with my colleagues here, Marina Walker, 2019 JSK Fellow and Deputy Director of the International Consortium on Investigative Journalism in Washington, D.C., and Cécile Prieur, who is a 2019 Fellow and a Deputy Editor of Le Monde in Paris. And both Prieur and Walker have worked on sweeping investigations, including the Panama Papers, which exposed the financial dealings of offshore business entities and won the 2017 Pulitzer Prize for explanatory reporting. Just a few points of business here for tonight. We will have a break, a 5-minute break or so after the first session, and at about 5 to 8. In the second hour, Michael Bolden, who's our JSK Managing Director for Communications and co-host of this course, will moderate a second session. And that will be a conversation with Sally Busby, Executive Editor of the Associated Press, and Daniel Dale, White House Correspondent for the Toronto Star. They're going to talk about how news organizations and journalists help the public hold institutions such as government agencies accountable to the citizenry. Just like last week, we'll have a chance for you to ask a few questions. We have index cards that are available for your questions. Erica Bartholomew on our staff, raise your hand, Erica, will be available to pick up your cards. If you have a question, you could raise your hand and she'll get a card to you, and you can pass the card back to the aisle toward Erica. We'll try to reserve about 10 minutes at the end of each session to answer a few questions. The full syllabus for this course is on Canvas, and I hope a number of you are going there. We're putting new resources there every week. We've got biographical information for the speakers, books, articles, reports, and one of the new things we put up last week was a great 4-minute video about the Panama Papers that explains what's going on. And our guests in this first session tonight, Marina Walker and Cécile Prieur, will tell the story behind the Panama Papers. It was one of the biggest leaks and the largest collaboration investigative journalism projects in history. It was a leak of 11.5 million financial and legal records. And it exposed not just some bad apples, but a whole system that enabled crime, corruption, and wrongdoing. And it was by hidden offshore companies. The story at its core is of the super rich and elite working the system to avoid paying their taxes, something that most of us can't avoid. This project included journalists from more than 107 organizations in 80 countries. That's a lot of journalists who analyzed the terabytes of data. After more than a year of analysis, the first news stories were published in April 2016. And this project not only is a massive journalism investigation, but it also represented a really important milestone in the use of data journalism tools and unprecedented collaboration by usually competitive journalists around the world. There have been a major number of impacts of this. We'll talk about that tonight. And including a few world leaders were forced to resign. There have been audits, investigations, prosecutions, and a change in how these rules around secret tax havens are set up and allowed to exist or not. And in fact, the story has gotten so much attention. Meryl Streep is reportedly going to be playing the lead in a movie based on the Panama Papers, which we hear is tentatively called The Laundromat. So just briefly, a little more on our two speakers, and then let's have a great conversation. Marina Walker is a member of the JSK Fellowships class of 2019. As I said, she's the Deputy Director of the International Consortium on Investigative Journalists. She managed the two largest collaborations of reporters in journalism history, the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers. Both investigations involved hundreds of journalists using technology to unravel stories of public interest from giant amounts of leaked financial data. And corralling the data and the journalists, I think, was a big job. Cécile Prieur is a member of the JSK Fellowships class of 2019, and she's the deputy editor at Le Monde, one of the leading daily newspapers in France, where she's in charge of digital transformation and in charge of investigations in collaboration with the International Consortium on Online Journalism. Very pleased to have both of them here with us tonight. So let's get going. How did this evolve from a leak from one German news organization to become one of the largest collaborative journalism projects in history?
Thank you so much first, Dawn and Michael, for inviting us and having us here tonight. And thank you, all of you, for your interest in journalism. We really need you, especially these days. So how this whole thing started? Well, there were two very intrepid German reporters who were doing their work. These things don't happen out of thin air. You know, reporters are beat reporters. They do their stories and they stay with their stories. And these reporters had been reporting the offshore financial story for a long time in collaboration with ICIJ. And there were people, and I'm going to explain why I say people, sources. We don't know. These sources are anonymous. The source decided to call himself John Doe, but we don't know if it is a man or a woman or many people. So, but we'll call it John Doe, which is what he or she decided. John Doe noticed these reporters that were staying on this important story, a story that he realized was not just about offshore accounts, it was about inequality. Because this secret world of tax havens is at the root of the big inequality crisis that we are experiencing. Why is that? Because it allows the most powerful people and companies in our society to play by a different set of rules and to basically accumulate enormous amounts of untaxed and unaccountable wealth. This source had access, we don't know how, to an enormous amount of data that came from one of the suspect law firms. Those of us who had been reporting on this, we knew of Mossack Fonseca. And Mossack Fonseca had surfaced in relationship to the Assad regime and other autocratic regimes around the world.
And that was a law firm.
Panamanian law firm.
Panamanian law firm.
And they specialize in selling secrecy. Secrecy is the product that tax havens advertise and are proud of to offer. Extreme secrecy. So what does that mean? That if somebody reveals in the British Virgin Islands or in the Cayman Islands the owners or the directors of a company, that person can go to jail for as long as 20 years. That's what tax havens sell, that secrecy. So this source made this information available, contacted these journalists after contacting other newspapers in the US and apparently didn't get a response and decided to go to Germany. The reporters, thankfully, were very eager to talk to the source. They asked the reasons, why are you doing this? And the source said, because I want these crimes exposed. And so they received the data, and shortly after reviewing it, or starting to review what they could, because imagine it was more than 11 million records of financial statements, loan agreements, emails. It was all the working documents of these lawyers and accountants in this Panamanian law firm for a period of 40 years, interacting with with world leaders, like the Prime Minister of Iceland, the Prime Minister of Pakistan, some of the world's biggest corporations and banks. And all of that information was delivered to them, and at that point, they realized they could not, this was a story that transcended them, that they could not hoard this information, which is what we naturally do, investigative reporters. That's our DNA, not sharing. We all have been lone wolves, right? But they decided that this was a historic event and that they needed to treat it in that way. And that was the next step, which was contacting the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. We are a network of hundreds of reporters around the world who we are on a task to defeat the lone wolf, and we believe that stories are better and more powerful when we share resources, when we share reporting, and when we protect one another in the process of sharing. So that was the model that was chosen for this story that pointed to 200 countries around the world.
So Cécile, you were a top editor in one of those newsrooms. So this is the organization that's connecting all the newsrooms, and you were at Le Monde. What did you do when you found out? You had some information early, in fact, to share.
Yeah, so we at Le Monde, good night. Good evening to everybody. Sorry. We used to work with the ICIJ for a couple of years before Panama Papers.
Okay.
We were involved in the very beginning of their international collaboration, and we were very proud to be in the roots of the story. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I will speak. Oh, my microphone was on.
It was underneath her jacket.
Yeah. So I just told you that we were already involved in the collaboration with ICIJ before Gerard Weil, the director of
Gerald Rye,
contacted us after a leak what we share with ICIJ, which was the previous leak before Panama Papers, which was Swiss leaks.
So there was a previous leak, and you all shared that with the ICFJ. Another leak.
We had a data set from a whistleblower from HSBC. It's difficult for me to tell it in English, which is a Swiss bank, which is involved in a lot of fraud tax on tax evasion account. And we had this data set, and we had the same feeling that our colleagues of Süddeutsche Zeitung had a couple of years after, that we cannot handle with this international data. And it was interesting because in our newsroom we were used to work in investigation side with well-known investigator, very independent and lone wolves.
Very independent journalists who work on their own.
We figure out that we cannot work like that as a last traditional way of investigate.
Right.
And so we have to settle a totally new team to do that. So we trying to do that for Swiss League, but it was not so efficient. And after, when Marina and Gerald contacted us for the Panama Papers, we had the experience that we couldn't doing the business as usual, and that for the Panama Papers we had, because it was so enormous and it was so important for democratic issues and for our now working as journalists, that we have to try to set a total new way of investigate, and that's what we decided to do.
Right.
We built a team with very young data reporters, very talented one, and with some more experienced people involved in financial issues, and we mixed that team, and it was the first time in my newspaper that we create a total mixed team between digital and print side.
So a digital,
and that's why
digital and
it
journalism
had worked.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that struck me when I very first heard about the Panama Papers is how in the world did you get 300 journalists to not break an embargo? Because, as you said, many journalists have been lone wolves. Obviously, this is a different way of working. But I just loved you to talk about how you organized and what kind of motivations did the reporters have to not break the embargo?
First of all, why we decided to work with so many journalists, why we're so crazy to do something like this. And it was because when we looked at the data, we realized, as I said before, that it was such a global story. And how can a reporter in Canada, as much as Daniel will love how much you guys know, or in Argentina, or in Norway, would know the story of Morocco, the story of Namibia, the story of Chile. So we needed to contact or try to recruit for this effort as many journalists as possible. I always say corruption is always first local. And in this data, it was always first local. You needed to know the name of the proxies, the name of the lawyers, the name of the best friend of Vladimir Putin who was in the data. Because Vladimir Putin is not going to be in the data or in any bank statement, right? But his best friend is going to be there and is going to be, in this case, sending amounts of $300 million at a time in fake loans. We also heard the term fake loans last week, if you remember, in the story that the New York Times wrote about the way that Trump created his wealth from his dad.
Right.
So, going back to the question, that was the motivation to create this large team was to do justice to the story. We tried to create a very diverse team, so not just big media organizations. We do have Le Monde and the BBC and The Guardian, but we also included a lot of small digital outlets in crucial places like Tunisia, Morocco, Algeria, and Philippines. We needed the gutsy reporters, the real deal investigators in all of those countries. For the reporters, I think the incentive was that they felt that they were part of something that transcended their egos, transcended the politics of their newsrooms that are so toxic sometimes, transcended the politics of their countries and the censorship that many of them experienced. It gave them the chance to play at a complete different level. It gave them the chance, in some ways, and I say this humbly, to reinvent their profession. At a time of so much pessimism and persecution and false news, they had the chance to turn it on its head and say, we are going to do this story, we are going to do this story together, we are going to share everything radically, that means footage, documents, editing if it was needed, although we try to keep those things a little separate because each partner preserves their own editorial independence, and that is very important. But everything that could be shared, knowledge, the most important thing one human being can share, was shared in this collaboration. And that lifted up those that didn't have resources in smaller newsrooms. It made the big newsrooms a little bit more humble. And also the big newsrooms, sometimes they actually don't have access in places in remote areas of the world or in many countries, these days because foreign bureaus have closed. So it was a win-win for everyone. And there was a little bit of a historic sense of mission. We are here doing something that we all thought, if we, excuse me for the word, but if we screw it up, it's going to be not only a big embarrassment, we're going to be sending a message that these collaborations really don't work for journalists, and much less at this global level. We are going to be putting a source in danger, and we are going to be missing the opportunity to tell these crucial urgent stories of public interest. So all of that, I would remind them, all of those things often as a project leader, and very often. And I think that that's what kept people, silent for, 376 reporters for more than a year. I told them, don't talk to your spouse, to your partner about this. Don't talk to your parents about this. get a life, talk about something else.
Get a life.
Not about who you found in the Paradise Papers or the Panama Papers.
So for you in your newsroom, what were some of the exciting or different and different ways of working, but also what were some of the exciting moments out of this project? And I would also say, how many times has there been a woman leading a project like this in Le Monde?
I think there is a lot of exciting moments in this incredible project, and I totally agree with Marina about the proud and we had the feeling that we were involved in a big story and that we were making, in a way, a little bit history of journalism, but it was much more on the way we investigate, because it was very new for us. And we haven't predict the super important impact that we had in global, obviously, but even in France. So we were much more trying to face, to handle with these big issues and trying to be at the level of the collaboration, because what you have to figure out is that ICIJ has built a tool, a software where every reporters share, report, investigate.
Oh, so I was going to ask about how actually physically,
share,
software.
And share their, what they discovered. My team has to be on the level of that. So we were very focused on how we can investigate in the good way the data, because the data doesn't speak alone.
The data doesn't speak alone.
No, you have to ask the data something. So you have to put a name in the data set, maybe Vladimir Putin, or the former president of France, or the big owners of company, a French company, or our shareholders, for example, because we obviously we put every name of our company and we put our names in the data set to be sure that we have no issue about that. So you put all the people that you could know, and the French deputies, and that's and we did that in a very series, very. It was not I have ideas, so I put that. So we just. Sorry. We think about a lot about that, trying to be very tactical in a way, logical in our research. And what maybe the big milestones, well, in the very beginning, when you discover the huge issue that we have to handle, and we used to meet very regularly, and my reporters explained to us that we discovered, and I remember that for a couple of meetings we were just wow, and it was just wow.
A lot of wows.
And we have to keep all that secret, because as Marina said, we couldn't speak about that in our newsroom, so we were in the very secret room, and we set up a totally myth about that, and we hadn't the same name of the operation, because ICIJ named the operation, but we decided to put another name, and so we didn't share anything.
Like a code name, right?
Oh,
like
a code name for the project.
Yeah, so the project.
What was the code name?
Our code name?
Yeah, go ahead.
It was Apollo.
Apollo. Okay.
Our code name was Prometheus.
Prometheus. Okay.
So we decided just to choose another mythologic name, and ICIJ said put a big secrecy rules, and we follow that, of course, and we had our own rules of secrecy in our newsroom, but nobody knows about that.
Yeah.
And what was difficult is that when you are very close to the launch, it's maybe 1 month ago or 2 months before the launch, we have to
close to the launch, when it's
almost going to release. You have to speak a lot of people, the photo reporters, the graphic designers,
so more and more people are involved.
More and more people are on the loop, and that is the critical point, that because these people have to figure out that it's so important that they don't have to speak outside of the newsroom.
Great. Who were some of the names of people that came up that were surprising in the Panama Papers?
So the Panama Papers, I think, not to revolve too much around a story that everyone is obsessed with, which is Russia, but I have to say it was the first time for all the talk that we talk about the kleptocracy in Russia, to be able to see how it works, to be able to see the mechanism of how how money is stripped from public companies, from state companies, and how money is then shuffled around the world, bank account through bank account, in the form of these loans that are like 1% loan, like 1% interest, 30-year loan, and to be able to follow the trajectory, to see how it comes through the US, how it goes through Europe, how it goes through Cyprus, and how it goes back to Russia, to the pockets of that very inner circle of President Putin. It was quite incredible. We counted $2 billion, so we had these incredible spreadsheets and databases where some of our colleagues work day and night, counting basically dollar by dollar. And when the story broke, Putin, he did two things. The first thing was to say, this is a CIA conspiracy. The second thing he said was, the story is actually accurate. The money is accurate. We were like,
Wow.
But what these reporters missed is that, so his best friend that was at the center of the scheme is a cellist, a musician. And he said what they missed is that all that money, the $2 billion, we intended to use it to purchase musical instruments for the St. Petersburg Orchestra.
Oh,
so
okay, well then it's all fine.
Yeah. So besides him, Prime Minister Cameron of the UK was in the Panama Papers, and it was very embarrassing because, in fact, it was his dad's fund in the Bahamas that was in the papers. And Cameron denied until 4 days after publication that he had anything to do with this fund. And it was kind of spiraling down, down, down until like 4 days after publication, he came out and said, in fact, I knew everything, this is real, I knew it existed, and I also profited from it because I sold my shares. He didn't make a ton of money. But I think it was, we saw in world leaders like that, also in Argentina, where President Macri was a new president at the time, and it was quite damaging to him to appear there. Some of them may have been doing worse things than others, but those that maybe weren't doing that terrible things, perhaps just wanted secrecy or tax avoidance, which they don't consider is a big deal, because they denied and because they had that arrogance of, I don't have to explain this to anybody. They ended up getting themselves in more and more trouble. That happened also to the Prime Minister of Iceland, who also had not disclosed investments he had through the British Virgin Islands in the failed banks from the 2008 crisis in Iceland that almost took the country down.
I want to interrupt you for a second about the Prime Minister of Iceland, because if any of you watch, we put a 4-minute video up about the Panama Papers. There's a great scene where the Prime Minister is being interviewed. I don't know, a reporter.
That was a nice example of collaboration.
Yes.
So in Iceland, so what do you do in Iceland that is population? And I don't know actually the population, but it's something like 200,000 people. And the reporter finds that the Prime Minister is big time in this information, in this data, and that he's not going to be able to publish the story. He has to hold the story for more than a year to give time to everybody else to find their Prime Minister and their big stories, right? So what do you do as a reporter? And so what he did was, he did something quite heroic, which is he quit the public broadcaster where he used to work, because he said, if I continue working there and I have to share this with my editors, there is no way that this story is going to hold. even if not because they're going to force me to publish, but because it's just too small of a country and the relationships are just too tight.
Wow.
So he quit his job. Everybody thought he was going crazy. He covered the windows of his house with paper because he felt like he was going to be working there for a year and he didn't want people to look inside.
Wow.
Natural light is very important in a country like Iceland where it's like night for like 6 months. And he stayed there and he worked in isolation without a salary until like 2 months before publication. The interview with the Prime Minister was a cooperation with the Swedish television.
That was the reporter.
Because if this investigative reporter requested an interview with the Prime Minister was going to immediately know that something was up. So the Swedish team requested the interview. The Icelandic guy was there as well. And the interview is it's an amazing, if you can watch it, please do.
So the interview is amazing from what you see in the clip, which is he is there being interviewed. He doesn't really have any answer to the question about what do you know about this company. I don't remember which the company. Wintris. And then in the clip goes on to another image. But you told me what happened after.
He ended up escaping, leaving the interview and hiding in the kitchen of the presidential palace until the crews left. He had to resign about 3 or 4 days. At the time that Cameron was admitting that he knew about these investments, the Prime Minister resigned. Right. And others resigned later, like the Prime Minister of Pakistan, who had a lot of real estate in London that he was owning through anonymous companies.
Wow. So in France, what was the reaction, and why did people care that the stories had the French connections with that?
In the very beginning of the operation, they were a big focus on what we will reveal in the following days, because what you have to figure out is that we have all international embargoes, so we can't put all our stories in the same time because it will be nonsense.
Yeah.
So Marina set up embargoes with all the newsrooms. So she did a great job about totally editor-in-chief.
So it's like staggered embargoes, or how did you do that?
Yeah, so we didn't want to burn all the stories on day one. So we were like, let's tackle one world leader at a time and give them their time and one company at a time. So that was also hard because in some parts of the world, it was more important than in others. So, according to where you were, is what story you wanted to go first, second, or third. But we were able to reach some broad agreements, and it worked out.
Great.
And so because it was an operation who lasts 5 days, so it was a super long operation for an investigation.
Yeah.
We launched that Sunday in the evening in France, and we finished in the Friday in the morning. And so we told people that we had following revelation to do. And so it makes a super big attention on our operation, because in the very beginning it was Putin, it was Michel Platini, French football, sports, it was
Messi.
People like that, Messi, Lionel Messi, and so it was the very beginning of the operation. And 2 days after, we launched our own revelation about France. And we just said that it was involving a party, a political party in France. There is a big, huge attempt. And so it was a National Front, which is a very far-right extremist party, which had an account on the offshore account because they wanted to hide about 300,000 euros, and she's totally avoiding tax and totally illegal. And so it put some light contradiction between their current way of dealing with political affairs, and the fact that they are just some criminals in a way. So that was a huge story for us, and plus the French revelation involved two banks, well-known bank in France, which is called Société Générale, which is mostly did the same thing that HSBC, which is created some offshore account for their main clients.
So a bank, offshore accounts for their big clients. Mm.
Yeah, and that was mostly the big stories. There is a ton of little stories, but the big stories for Panama Papers. But for the Paradise Papers, we found.
Let's say there's a Panama Papers you've talked about, and then there's the Paradise Papers.
Yeah,
just say a little bit about what the difference, or what those two.
So they were subsequent. So after Panama Papers, we thought we had seen it all, and we should just move on from the offshore story. And here comes the Paradise Papers. And the Paradise Papers, whereas the Panama Papers was more like the more rogue side of the offshore economy, with a lot of the money laundering, the autocrats, the dictators, the drug money. The Paradise Papers goes to the heart of our economy. It's the mainstream economy. Mm. And that mainstream economy, with all the big banks and the multinational companies like Nike and Apple and the Queen of England and Bono, all of those characters were also part of this secret world. They also had bought that secrecy to hide affairs, to hide money, to avoid taxes. So it was an important project to show, no, this is not just a story of rogue elements. This is the economy that we have given ourselves, and again, the reason why we're experiencing so much inequality. Mm-hmm.
So it's not something, on a rogue element, it is the economy.
And it was also like, for Panama Papers, we got a lot of support and very little pushback, except from the people who were actually, involved in the crimes. But in general, everybody was outraged. With Paradise Papers, because it touched so much of the mainstream economy, we got a lot more pushback. Law firms and mainstream law firms that had supported us and were outraged about the Panama Papers suddenly were like, well, maybe you're going a little bit too far.
So you were saying about the Panama Papers and Le Monde.
And during the Paradise Papers, we have exactly the same feeling that Marina just described, that it was much more difficult to push that story, even if they are the big cases in the story, because it was involving the way of the tax haven fueled the economy, and the way that rich people use very little gap in the laws to use that in a legal way. It's not very legal, but it's not illegal either. In the very, if you put if you think about that in a very lawyer way. So they used to hire the big lawyers just to find some hole in the law to put their money. And so that's why it's much more difficult for us to debate about that, because in France we have this feeling that the politicians were much more involved for the Panama Papers. They were much more eager to denounce the tax haven, but for Paradise Papers they are much more reserved, because they know that the financial world doesn't want to be more regulate about that.
Right.
So, and that's why it was very interesting, and we have the feeling that we touch the limit of the exercise, and but we did a lot of editorials to denounce that, and we did a lot of interviews, but we have been much more challenged by Paradise Papers rather than Panama Papers.
I think that is an important point. Sometimes there might be the misconception that investigative journalists should only focus on illegal activities and crimes. Mm-hmm. And actually the legal corruption, what I call legal corruption, is often so much more important and requires a lot more courage.
Kind of gray
because
areas.
It's the gray areas of our society, like tax. So areas that might be legal because that's what a few powerful people have decided and have put laws around it, just like slavery was legal for how long. And that doesn't mean that they are not completely immoral systems. And for us investigative journalists, it's really important to get the courage to go and to expose those very moral systems that might be legal, but that doesn't mean that they're not oppressing people and they're not creating a lot of injustice.
So what were some of the biggest impacts of the Panama and Paradise Papers, and why should people care?
Okay. Well, in the United States, according to recent estimates, the 1%, the wealthiest 1% of the population owns at this point more wealth than the 90%, the bottom 90% combined. We are probably at, people call it a new gilded era. We are at the worst of inequality. And so we should care because of that. We should care because governments or these accountancy acrobatics are robbing governments from very, very much needed tax money. And I'm preaching to the choir, I hope here, but taxes are something that we do to pay for police and for school and for roads and for public spaces and for programs that make kids with less privilege have better opportunities at succeeding in life. And it's so corrosive to see how these tax avoidance and tax evasion schemes, they cut across political parties. We're not talking about conservatives here, we're talking about conservatives and liberals. And in the Paradise Papers, it was really eye-opening to see, and we shouldn't be surprised about it, but that a lot of the people that had the biggest fortunes in these tax havens were actually Democratic donors. There was one particular donor who had a foundation in Bermuda that if he would bring the money to the US in the billions of dollars, I forgot how many billions, I think it was like 12 billion, it would constitute one of the top 3 largest foundations in the US.
Wow.
That foundation in Bermuda had never given a grant, didn't have a website, didn't have any accountability. Wow. And so that's when I talk about going to the heart of the system and how in some ways, the responsibility is really distributed. And that's why these stories are so hard. It's hard to make people care. That's why the story in the New York Times from last week didn't make it everywhere. It was a precise story, a complicated, a complex story, a really important story. But the big challenge is how we connect these stories with people's personal experience. How do we make them make that click? And I think in the Panama Papers we were able to do that with a lot of effort, and that's why we saw people. But that was one of the most, rewarding moments of that big effort, to see people going out to public squares in Malta, in Reykjavik, in Buenos Aires, in London, going out in the public square like in the old times and putting pressure on their leaders and saying, we enough.
Right. I had one last question for both of you, and then we'll go to your questions. So both of you are women leaders in journalism organizations, and women are still a minority in leadership in journalism and in government. We've seen a little bit of that in the last few weeks. What impact do you think, if any, did it have being women leaders in what you've called radical collaboration, a process where you're doing things very differently than has been done before? It's not the lone wolf, it's not the sort of old model. What impact did it have, do you think, being women leaders in your organizations?
I don't know if it is the woman card which talk for leading kind of investigation, but definitely I think this kind of work needs to be settled with trust. Trust between people, transparency. Radical transparency.
Radical transparency.
In the secret team, that you have to be totally transparent. And equality in a way. So that's the way I tried to work with my team. That means that we have a challenge about equality between digital reporter. We were very young and not well known in my newsroom, and print experts. We were much more older, and the basis on that work, that's what I put on the table is why every people is equal in that team. But because I don't think I have said like that, but it was so much obvious that the way we are obliged to work, that it's totally a cooperation between them and an exchange of skills between the juniors and the seniors, and there were no top people in this team. I don't know if it is a woman way of putting things, but it was my way.
It was your way.
And so I can't go.
You did it your way.
Yeah, I did it in my way, exactly.
Marina, one.
My way was, I had been in enough collaborations that were really painful in the past, that were led by others. So I took note. I had learned a lot of painful lessons. And I tried to focus not only on the outcome, which of course we all wanted that amazing outcome, but on the process. In this, it was really important to guarantee a really diverse and supportive environment for journalists that were working across languages, across time zones, across journalistic experiences, and to create that equality, like no, there's not gonna be the BBC and the little guy. Everybody in this is equal. Everybody has the same voice, has the same responsibilities. And so because we wanted this model to work, so we can continue it and others there collaborate, we put a lot of effort in selecting who's going to be part of these collaborations, because I don't believe that everybody's made to be a collaborator, and I think it's fair to acknowledge that. So we put a lot of effort. In the past, we had, learning from all mistakes, we had focused a lot on like who's the best reporter, the best track record that has brought down more government. And now we look at the track record, of course, and the accomplishments, but we also look at the emotional intelligence and the team playing abilities of the reporters. We look at the full person. Okay. And if we do more of that across industries, perhaps we're going to have better and more impactful results.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
We're going to go to your questions now. Okay, the first question, which is a good one. Were there news organizations who did not participate in the collaborations that you wish had? Were they the same ones who passed on the story?
I can imagine who asked that.
And this is just between us.
There were organizations who declined to be part of the Panama Papers and previous and subsequent collaborations, and it's public information, and that's why I can discuss it. Like the New York Times was one organization that we always had difficulties trying to collaborate with, so we collaborated with the newspaper chain McClatchy for the Panama Papers. And when the Panama Papers published, the New York Times readers actually held the New York Times accountable for that and started asking, why are we not reading this story in the New York Times? And the New York Times acted really well. The public editor wrote an op-ed and talked to us, and we said, who doesn't want to work with the New York Times? I want to. So the doors are open if they want to collaborate with colleagues from around the world. And they came, and there was a delegation of New York Times editors, so it's a nice feeling in our little scrappy newsroom. And we collaborated with them on the Paradise Papers. I believe you have shared some of the stories that the New York Times did on the Paradise Papers, including Wilbur Ross, our Secretary of Commerce, who was doing business with Putin's son-in-law.
Right.
Again, Mr.
Right. Good. Were any of Trump's interests or buildings involved?
I have to. So each of these leaks is a window into the secret world, And we haven't seen the full secret world. We have seen parts of it. And there's a part of the secret world that we have seen even less, and it's the tax havens that are embedded within the United States. And I'm talking not just about Delaware, but I'm talking about Nevada, I'm talking about Wyoming. There are pockets of tax havens. It's easier these days to create an anonymous companies in the name of Mickey Mouse, and that experiment has been done by a documentary crew. They created a company and they put Mickey Mouse as the director and shareholder, and nobody blinked, right? What's the big deal of creating such company? Well, then you go and you can put a bank account. That company can become, can have a bank account. That's the problem. And then you just put the money there, launder the money, whatever you want to do. And the question was, and I went through. Trump.
Were there any of Trump's interests or buildings
So in the
involved?
Paradise Papers, we haven't found his personal money in any of these leaks. We did find a lot of associates of Trump's, some of his biggest donors, members of his cabinet, personal friends, and there were very interesting stories. Gary Cohn, remember the former Trump economic advisor, said something very telling when we asked for comment, or when the stories came out. He said, "Oh well, this is really not important because." Guess what? This is how the world works.
Wow. So follow-up here, was George Soros or any of his investment vehicles found in the papers?
And we reported about that, and this goes to the heart of what I said, that this is not liberal or conservative. Everybody's doing it. It's the economy, and Mr. Soros had some investment vehicles that were done through tax havens. And in the Paradise Papers, we reported about that. Soros is also a funder of my organization, and he also funds a lot of other investigative reporting, independent investigative reporting media around the world.
What was the thing you found most surprising during either the Panama Papers or Paradise Papers? Maybe you were involved in the Paradise Papers, especially. Do you?
The most
surprising thing.
Discovery of.
I think you can take that question anywhere you want.
The most surprising at the very end of our investigation has been to discover that the most rich people of France was in the data set, and he was very well.
The richest person in France was in the set.
And it is the CEO of Louis Vuitton, which is a luxury brand, the best luxury brand in France. And he was very well hidden between a lot of layers of financial account, and we figured that he had 7 different offshore accounts around France, and that was a big story for us, and that was totally very interesting because it was for a lawyer point of view, it was not illegal, but it was totally immoral to do that, and plus it was very shameful for him because he's well known as a very powerful people, and knowing that he's putting some money around a lot of different accounts not in France, and even if he said that the fiscal administration in France were very known that organization, it was very a shame for him to be in front of our newspaper. So it was the most exciting news for us, and we were very proud of that because we just discovered that at the very end of the operation.
At the very end?
Yeah, and maybe 3 weeks before.
3 weeks.
And that's totally the hard work of our data team, and because they are very harsh in their investigation, and they are tough people who didn't want to, never want to just to handle the operation, that we finally discover him.
Wow.
And it was the most huge impact for us.
That would be huge. We have a question here. Tell us more about the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists.
Oh, okay. So the ICIJ, those are the initials, was created about 20 years ago by a guy, a great journalist called Chuck Lewis, who used to work at 60 Minutes, was a producer, and he got tired of not being able to tell the stories he really wanted to tell, even working in 60 Minutes. So he went on to create something called the Center for Public Integrity, which is a US-based, Washington-based investigative reporting outlet focusing mostly on US issues, money in politics. And then Chuck, through his travels around the world, had been meeting with all the lone wolves. And he had realized that the lone wolves were all telling him that they were investigating the same thing. They were investigating the same companies, the Siemens bribery scheme and this other, but they had no idea. They were not connected. This was pre-internet. So Chuck, who was a visionary, thought about this network, was like, what if we bring them all together and have them talk to one another? So he actually brought them together physically, you may correct me, here to Stanford, and there was another a meeting elsewhere, I forgot where, Harvard, I don't know. But they met in person in 1997, 98, and they started sharing for the first time, almost pre-internet, documents, ideas, collaborated on stories about tobacco smuggling, about how Philip Morris and BAT had colluded with criminals all over the world to smuggle cigarettes, and went on to continue doing collaborations for several years until all these financial leaks came our way and forced us to kind of take that model to a more global level and to leverage technology. Because for a long time, we were basically collaborating through email and face-to-face, and that's no way to collaborate when you want to do it at this level. So then we brought technology, and technology helped us deal with these terabytes of data.
Great. Just room for a couple more
We're
questions.
nonprofit, should I say that?
Definitely
nonprofit and accepting donations from the public. We also love when people volunteer their talents. We're very open. We get a lot, and I have to say, in these financial leaks, there are a lot of silent heroes, former accountants and former lawyers, or who basically called us and said, I will help you read documents. I don't need credit. I don't need money. Wow. I don't need to sign a non-disclosure agreement. I'm just going to help you understand this to get the story out. So if you have expertise and want to work with us, please don't hesitate to contact us.
Okay. We'll send out her email after we're done. How many successful prosecutions with prison terms so far? How much money recovered? How many current prosecutions? So what are some of the?
The latest numbers I have is the money recuperated so far, and this is an incredibly conservative estimate, is about $1 billion. That is money in taxes that a handful of governments around the world have announced publicly that they have recuperated. Think that we worked in 80 countries. The majority of those countries doesn't make that information available, like including the United States. We know that they are working on the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers and contacting the people named there, but they haven't disclosed. So a lot of money. There are about 170 open official inquiries in 79 countries around the world. So those are ongoing parliamentary investigations, prosecutions of different kinds. One of the most profound impacts was the recent announcement by England that it would force its British territories and dependencies, the majority of which are tax havens, to start disclosing what is called beneficial ownership information, which is basically who owns a company, which is the secret information.
Right.
So if that happens, if they follow through, that would be a game changer, a real game changer for democracy, for transparency, for journalism.
Right. And the Prime Minister of Iceland, of course, resigned.
Yeah, and we have the resignations. We know that there are so many things. The tax authorities, 30 countries, are now, they have their own consortium model after ours, and they actually share information and they meet in person. So wow. if that's great. They were not talking to one another and had no idea, and now they are.
Great. So last question we have time for today. Is there any new information coming out about the Panama Papers or the Paradise Papers? Is there any other things what happens after the publication of and release of those stories?
This is very much, and I don't know if you would agree, but it's very much an active leak, an active story. All the time we're giving access to US publications, to foreign publications. Every time there's a scandal, there's a new person in a cabinet, there's a new nominee of something, these organizations are requesting access. The database contains more than 30 million documents right now, secret documents, confidential documents, and we are working with more than 500 journalists all over the world. And they are, I would say every other week, there's a new story somewhere in the world that draws from this information. And we hope that whistleblowers keep coming. We need to protect those whistleblowers, and I would like to end, thanking the whistleblower, John Doe, and the whistleblower of the Paradise Papers for their courage to come forward. For the fear that they experienced, for the trust that they had when we were telling them, don't worry, it's going to take us a year and it's hundreds of us and it has never been done before, but we'll get it done.
But trust us.
Trust us. I want to honor the people who come forward at great personal risk, and I hope that our countries can protect them better in the future.
Right, thank you.
And I will add that it is totally a continuing story because we ask many questions to the Panama Papers basis right now, because at every time we have a new case of investigation, a national one, an international one, we just ask. We just put new names in our basis, and right now we have a huge basis sharing with the help of ICIJ, and plus in Europe, the ICIJ experience gives a very great insight to many newsrooms, and we are involved in a lot of little collaboration and cooperation, and the main last well-known was about the Daphne project. I didn't know if you had heard about that. It was blogger woman who have been killed in Malta. Yes. His first name was Daphne. And a French reporter with a German one, which were so Deutsche Zeitung reporter, settled a corporation, and we were involved in this corporation. And with I think there were 30 reporters. We came to Malta again and reopened the case of the journalist work on, and we have a lot of. My team is very involved in many operations because we are just well known now.
Yes, you're well known now.
We used to collaborate, and people know that. So that's I think it's Panama Papers was totally a milestone in the way of journalism could thrive in the future. And we couldn't have any more. We have always still our wolf loans, no problem, but we have to go on this cooperation between newsrooms.
Great, it's changed the way journalism.
One last thing just to finish is that, so another big message from these collaborations is, and that's the Daphne project, and by the way, 3 European reporters have been killed in the past year in Europe. They can kill the story, they can kill the reporter, they can silence the reporter, but these networks of collaborations guarantee that they cannot take away, they cannot silence the story, because the colleagues are going to continue the story for anybody who is shut down, who is silenced.
Right, that's very important. Well, I want to thank Marina Walker and Cécile Prieur today.